Thank you for having me. My name is James. I'm a software developer in Alex's lab at Nationwide Children's Hospital in the great state of Ohio. And yeah, I'm honored today to be brought here by the CGC to talk to you about information science. So specifically, I'll be talking about our issues and our working solutions in performing semantic alignment of drug and therapeutic knowledge. So under the mantle of the Variant Interpretation for Cancer Consortium's Knowledge Integration Project, our lab is broadly interested in aligning biomedical data such as drug and therapy data using normalized concepts in pursuit of clinical data harmonization from open access knowledge bases. And so these are projects like CIVIC and PharmGKB and Molecular Oncology Almanac that probably a lot of you are familiar with, as well as more domain-focused resources with a focus on drugs specifically, like Drug Bank, Chembl, and what have you. So the sort of image of what we'd like to achieve looks something like this. We think that there's an abstract normalized concept of something called imatinib with a stable identifier, and what we'd like to be able to do is look at information from a number of different contexts that hopefully is computable, and aggregate and group that information together to make it more readily usable in things like clinical pipelines, maybe also for purposes like machine learning. The problem is that you can't actually trust everything on the internet, apparently. The data that is available is fragmented, it's imperfectly structured and described, and it's also inconsistently referenced. So I'll kind of talk through a couple of a picture of how this looks. This is a bit of a toy example, but you might have a therapeutic response statement in one source that uses one term for a drug, like imatinib. A second source might refer to what you'd consider an equivalent alias for the same thing, but using pure string matching, as we call it in the biz, it would be difficult or at least a little complex to understand from a computational perspective that these are referring to the same concept, which is unfortunate. So instead, our hypothesis is something like this. We'd like to first develop a rich and structured description of the drug or the therapy itself, and then from there, be able to have more aliases or more references by which we can match things like clinical statements back to under a sort of bigger header. So a couple of ambiguities that I'll talk through. The first is referential. An individual therapy might go by a number of names, and a lot of these names are things that we're familiar with in clinical practice and scientific description. You might have the generic term as well as the labels that a drug is sold under, maybe something like the active ingredient. These are things that humans can readily understand, and a lot of times clinicians are, very aware of all of the different synonyms or colloquial terms by which a drug is described. But literature and knowledge bases may reference less human-readable terms as well, things like developmental IDs, which we probably don't remember, especially if these drugs are 20 to 30 years old, chemical structures, which are frankly, in my opinion, impossible to read, as well as database IDs, which sometimes provide some context. For example, identifiers from the Chembl resource typically include Chembl at their front, but that second identifier at the bottom, starting with D0, is from the therapeutic targets database. Without any context, a non-expert is probably unable to recognize this, and therefore it's difficult to trace it back to its original source. Aliases can also be overly broad. For example, we found a case where the term immunoglobulin gamma-1 chain C region was being used as an alias for a number of very distinct monoclonal antibodies, which again, made sort of not accurate and precise knowledge matching very difficult. Things like trastuzumab is often simply referred to as anti-HER2, referring to the sort of context of its use, which is a bit imprecise because there are other possible drugs that can fulfill that same meaning. And sometimes individual aliases are just entirely indeterminate. For example, the term A6 is used in databases to refer to a number of different chemicals that happen to include A6 at the end of their, an individual description of them. And so a term like this ends up mapping back to a number of wildly different contexts. Data that is provided by these knowledge sources is also given in a number of different formats and structures. The technical details are only important here if you're a gremlin like me, but the idea to take away is that the way that these resources export data can be wildly different, and it's sort of the way that individual attributes are conceptualized as part of the object can vary. For example, a semantic triple will sort of say that a property is framed in terms of a relationship between two objects. A is a B, whereas in key value terms, it's more like a single object has a number of properties grouped under them. We conducted a brief survey of a number of resources that we consider significant. The x-axis here indicates is just an array of different resources that are publicly available that we see a lot of references to in literature. The y-axis refers to the structure of data that they provide, like their sort of full export in. The takeaway here is that there are a lot of sources which only provide their data in one format, and they're the only source to provide data in that format. Which again means that there's not a lot of sort of shared work from a computational level that you can do to get all of this data together. It also means that you have to be somewhat opinionated in parsing through or sort of drawing relationships between how an individual source has framed their data and how another source has framed their data. You have to make some decisions about how to sort of normalize between those two structures. And finally, let's see, I will just, yeah. Next, a lot of sources sort of think about drugs or chemicals or whatever at different conceptual structures. For example, the Guide to Pharmacology, which I think is a pretty marvelous resource, refers to all of the units of its study, in this case as ligands, whereas something like the FDA only thinks about drug products. They don't know what a chemical is per se, at least not in the context of their computable data exports. And what this means is that these different sources tend to think about the objects that they're describing in slightly different ways. There are cases where, for example, like with a naturally occurring product, there are a lot of attributes that are given something like insulin that aren't really sort of relevant for something like a imatinib. A big problem is cross-referential ambiguity. Resources will provide cross-references saying that our source could be linked out to this other record in this other source. But when they don't annotate what the sort of meaning of that reference is, then we have to make a lot of inferences, or rather, more accurately, we're unable to make inferences that we would like. For example, if we don't know whether a relationship is supposed to convey equivalence or containment in one direction or another, or simply just conceptual relation, then we don't know if knowledge that applies to one record can be cleanly and commutatively applied to another record. So we've developed a software library, we're calling it Therapi, and I'll kind of describe the framework that we've chosen to perform this kind of knowledge alignment. As I've mentioned, yeah, it's a software library. It creates, at the end of the day, about 16,000 multi-source merged therapy records. It's available publicly, but outside of computational applications, it's, it's maybe not ready for, or not cleanly interpretable. It produces an object that is ideally applied in the context of a clinical pipeline. Briefly, the way that it sort of produces these normalized concepts, you can think of as starting with a number of different nodes on a graph, and each one of these nodes is a record described by an individual source, like DrugBank, Wikidata, RxNorm. And what we do is we progressively draw the cross-references that each one of these records contain to other sources that seem to be trustworthy to us. There's a fair amount of manual curation involved at the beginning. And after a while, these cross-references begin to draw concepts that seem to reflect the unique concepts that we'd like to see out of them that sort of describe aggregate clinically relevant structures. So at the end of the day, these concepts can be fairly rich. They can include a lot of data drawn from a number of different sources. And we're pretty happy. They exhibit properties that we're pretty happy with. They're able to convey information like regulatory status, which can be used as a proxy for something like drug maturity, which is something that we're very happy with. I'll kind of leave it there by noting that some of the more application-oriented details will be discussed by Matthew Cannon. I think is today Sunday. Then tomorrow would be Monday. In the morning, there's also a poster up in the poster hall for review. We also have a preprint that went live last week, working through a lot of the details here in more depth. In the future, we're particularly interested in applying some machine learning to this with respect to probabilistic methods, and we're thinking about its applications in natural language processing, particularly with the significant changes that things like GPTs have brought over the past year. So with that, I'll conclude with the conveyance that open source drug data, like everything on the internet, is a bit messy, but there's a lot of useful knowledge there. We are able to pool drug descriptions to define a normalized concept and mappings in support of data harmonization. With this, I'd like to thank our collaborators, many of whom are very, very close to me right now, as well as those elsewhere, and give our thanks to the NHGRI for funding this project. Yeah. Thank you.